if the gospel is still the driving force, the real engine, at the heart of it all, then actually you can see, and now we are beginning to see things that have, lasted 10 years plus. You can see what are the things that are lasting.
We're doing a class right now at course called Global Missions in the 21st Century. And as a part of the key course content for this class, we're doing interviews with leaders from around the world. And we are excited to release these to you and invite you to pull up a chair and listen in to these enriching discussions. All right, well, I'm joined today by Tim Coomar, who is the Operations Director for City to City Europe. Good to see you here today, Tim. We met, we met a couple years ago, I guess, in Athens, Greece, when we went there on a tour with some of our students here from Christ Our Redeemer. And so got to know you a little bit through that experience. You did some teaching for our group, and we got lunch one day and just connected and there and some other places since then. But Tim, you're married to Cynthia, right? And have three children.
Yeah.
You're originally from England, but you've been serving in Athens for quite a while now. You were co-church planter in the Exarchia part of Athens, which is, I'll let you share a little bit about that part of the city later on in our conversation. But since being serving in the church planter pastoral role, you've been working with City to City Europe as the interim director for a while, and now the operations director. So I want you to share more about that with us. But so you're British, but ended up planting a church in Athens, and now helping City to City Europe. Tell us a little bit about your journey.
So yeah, I was born in the UK and grew up there. But my background is my father is an immigrant from Sri Lanka, Tamil, and my mother is from Greece. She's from the north of Greece, and so she moved to England when she got married to my dad. So I guess I grew up. My father was kind of unrooted because the Tamil community is a little bit more dispersed. That there is a diaspora, but I guess my dad's family were a little bit more about the parties than the than the patriotism, whatever. And so he ended up coming to faith when he was a teenager, and his parents' lifestyle didn't really fit with that, and so he ended up living in the houses of people from his church in London. Um, my mum was from a Greek Orthodox background, and she was searching. And around the time she was searching, my dad traveled over to Greece for a holiday, and they met, and she ended up coming to faith. And so I've always grown up with my I grew up with my parents' experience, which was, first generation. They were first generation converts, first generation immigrants. They were deeply committed to the gospel, to the church, but not so much the institutional church, just wherever God led them to another community of believers. So they ended up kind of actually planting a church, although it was a strategic decision. We were in this uh, part of North London that didn't have a church, and they were praying to meet other Christians, and they ended up meeting a bunch of other people. They just started meeting together in the local school, and that was the church I grew up in. And we didn't use the terminology of church planting. I, I never considered it a church plant, but I was there at the launch service,
Right.
and grew up in that church, and it grew up. There were like 50 kids in our youth group when I was about 10 years old. Um, and but the other element was I was very connected with the Greek community. So I went to Greek school and went to Greece every summer. But I always considered Greece like a third world country that you go to for holiday and see your family. But I'd never would have imagined myself living there. And then at university, I studied Greek. University was also the place where I was discipled for the first time in a more systematic way. So, someone reading the Bible with me week in, week out, faithful Bible teaching, expository Bible teaching with the gospel firmly at the center. Um, you know, Lots of evangelism going on, very active Christian Union student movement. And I studied Greek at university, and as part of my studies, I spent the third year in the north of Greece in Thessalonica. And that was my first contact with the evangelical community in Greece. And I really enjoyed it. And I traveled all over. I got to know lots of people. And I came away with, I guess, a kind of ache, just recognizing the need there, because all of my friends that I'd made in the Greek evangelical community, most of them had never left the church as I had. I'd left, for a few years when I was a teenager. And so when I came to university, um, I was having to almost like learn things again. I'd taken a long break. They'd never left the church. Their whole life was the church. They were there several times a week, youth group, camp, conferences. But after just 1.5 years or 2 years of being taught the Bible at a good church in a university town in England, I kind of knew my way around the Bible, you know, um, in ways that they didn't.
Mm.
And I just thought that was a little bit ridiculous. Like, why, and I didn't see myself as like better than more advanced than them. I just was making the comparison, like, because I saw what was responsible for that in my case. It was nothing to do with me. It was to do with just some faithful people coming alongside me and walking that journey with me and opening the Bible with me and connecting me with other people who were also plugged in that way. And that just wasn't happening in Greece. There was
Mm.
no discipleship of that kind. But I never imagined that I would do anything like that. Um, but what happened was I had a job lined up after I finished university, and then that didn't work out because of timings. And I ended up working for a year with a ministry called Friends International that works with international students, so kind of evangelism and hospitality with international students. And at the end of that year, my supervisor urged me to go to Greece and just check things out, because I told him about this, that there was about the need for gospel workers in Greece. And I just thought I'd be going over there to see if there was possibility of doing an internship there for a year. And it was like a 1 year thing for me in my mind anyway. And I connected with Yotis, who's the pastor of the First Greek Evangelical Church. And he, even though the concept of internships at the time was basically it didn't exist, it like he'd only just introduced the idea through the back door at his own church within the last few months when I spoke with him. Um, and but he was up for it, and so he said, "Yeah, come back when you're ready," and because I could come back after a year, and let's get you set up. Reading the Bible with students, getting involved in student ministry and evangelism and stuff like that, and we'll take it from there. So I came back after a year. Um, I spent that year working with my dad, and I learned to build websites. I mention that because it's relevant for later, just to see how God prepares things. I was just paying my dad back because he paid for my university fees. I wasn't planning on using that, um, but I came back and started work as an intern, and I was reading the Bible with students, gathering them on Sundays, and also taking some of them to do evangelism on the university campuses in the center of Athens. And I'd grown up coming to Greece, hearing everyone say, "Oh, Greece is really hard soil." The the Greek Orthodox context means that people are very closed to talking about about Christianity, about faith, about God with anyone who's non-Orthodox. Um, and the moment you would try and do it, you just get shut down, and in some cases persecuted. And that was a reality for the evangelical church over many decades. Um, what I encountered amongst the young people on the university campuses, though, was nothing even remotely like that. There was a complete ignorance about Christianity. So they'd been forced to go to church at school for these certain times of the year on some holy days, and they've been forced to learn the Lord's Prayer, um, and maybe they go with their parents maybe once or twice a year, Easter for sure, and they'd go to. But the church, the language of the Greek Orthodox Church is an archaic form of Greek, so they didn't really understand most of it, and they were just not only disconnected from it, but also hostile to it because there'd been lots and lots of scandals. So they didn't really they'd that it emotionally unplugged from it. But the result of the not understanding anything that they were exposed to and not wanting to have anything to do with it now meant that they were basically ignorant of what Christianity actually says.
Mm.
And if they were at all interested to find out, they didn't know where to go, because the one place that represented Christianity in their minds was a no-go area. And this isn't everyone, but certainly back then it was a majority of young people. Just but when they encountered like people who were their age, who were Protestants, so they were not, it was like a kind of like a my enemy's enemy is my friend. So they knew that the Orthodox Church didn't like Protestants, um, and they didn't like the Orthodox Church. So they were actually quite positive about us. We got a good response,
Mm.
and they were just very curious. They would not have any problem at all conceding that they knew nothing about Christianity. Or if they did, they would give a few answers. If they did think they knew something, the things they knew would be nothing to do with what the gospel was about. It was to do with things to do with related to the church and traditions and stuff like that. And so when they saw people who came to them and wanted to talk about faith and had a living faith, they were genuinely curious to find out. And so the majority of the interactions we had with students on university campuses were um, were very not just positive, but um, they were deeply engaging. And I started to get really excited. And I was saying there is an opportunity here for the gospel amongst the whole generation of young Greek people. And what on earth, what are we doing about this? The evangelical church in Greece is not outward focused, and hadn't been for some time. Um, and the student work was one of the areas where there were people trying to go out, but it was a very, very, very weak student movement. Not many people involved, didn't have much support from the churches, and so a few months into that, I was already starting to get excited. And Yotis comes up to me one day and he says, "Tim, I finally realized why God has placed me in this big old traditional church." Because this is one of the few places where you can launch a vision for the city.
Mm.
Um, and and I was like, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I like the sound of that. And then he said, and how are we going to do that? We're not going to ask people to come to us. We're going to go to them. We're going to go and plant churches. And at the time, I didn't know what church planting was. I'd heard of it, but I had no conception of what it was. I think I considered it kind of like a niche thing that some people did. And so I just listened politely. And then he said something that really caught my attention. He said, "Oh, and the first church we're going to plant is in Exarchia." And Exarchia, that was the place where I'd been going to talk to the students. It was at the university campus that was on the edge of that neighborhood.
Mm.
And I just immediately plugged into the conversation in a new way. Um, and it became deeply personal for me. And I said, "Yo, this is exactly what I've been thinking for the last few weeks or whatever. That like there's this opportunity for the gospel amongst these people, and this is exactly where we need to be going." And I said, "Yeah, this must happen. I fully support this." And he's like, "Great, because I want you to to do it." and I was just caught up in it, and so I just said yes, without knowing what church planting was. I'd never heard of Tim Keller. Like that was 2008, so Tim Keller was just about to become well known in Europe. He wasn't yet well known. 2008 was when The Reason for God was published, and his name started being heard a lot more in more mainstream evangelical Christianity in Europe. Um, so I ended up on a plane to New York in about 4 or 5 months after that, and did the 6-week intensive for church planters. Um, Came back, did seminary, 1 year in England, 1 year in the US, and then moved to the neighborhood to plant the church.
So tell us, that's it's it's just amazing how God weaves all of these details from your dad being Sri Lankan and an immigrant and coming to Christ and planting a church with your mom kind of by accident. And it's just fast. It's always fascinating to hear how God weaves together so many different threads to get us to where he all along had wanted us to be. But yeah, and Yodas had shared in another interview did with him earlier just about his own heart transformation, really, as being, hey, how do we start to be a church for the city? And he tells the story of when this protesters are coming by and they literally throw a brick through the window of the first evangelical church there and say, wow, this is God breaking down some barrier here for me to look out to the people out there, and let's go to them. So it's neat to connect what he shared with his story with how that intersected with your story. But tell us a little bit more about Exarchia and what made that such a unique place, and what was church planting like among in that neighborhood.
Yeah, Exarchia is a very, I mean, at the time it was, and in some ways still is, a very unique place in Europe, and probably in Greece, sorry, and probably in Europe as well. At the time, it was considered um, the the European capital of anarchism, and that was just because of a long history of anarchist groups having that neighborhood as their base. And there are lots of historical and socioeconomic and even geographical reasons for that. What happened in the story that Yotis told you in 2008, that a policeman shot a boy in Exarchia, and that reinvigorated the anarchist movement. Um, and I guess that wave, it kind of activated a whole new generation of anti-authoritarian impulses, um, or anti-authoritarian impulses in a whole generation of people. And that generation happened to be essentially my age group, plus or minus 10 years. Um, and so we entered right in the middle of that. So it always had been that kind of place, but when we went, it was entering a new uh, period of peak activity in how much that anarchist movement in Athens was really at the forefront of um, like avant-garde thinking and activism, and taking the initiative. So you'd see lots of things that started in some of these groups, um, down the line becoming mainstream in Greek culture and society and politics. So, for instance, in the anarchist group that I ended up becoming a part of, it was a social center. Uh, the first meetings of Athens Pride were hosted in that social center, and at the time, it was very, very underground, outside the mainstream. And that was one of the only places where you could do something like that in Greek society. And then obviously it became mainstream and then commercialized. And now the anarchists, they hate it,
Mm-hmm.
the main pride thing, because it's now part of the system. And so they're some of the fiercest critics of it. Um, but some of the main values of that these groups would hold in common, because it was considered the anarchist capital not because they are united in any way, but just because there are so many groups, and a lot of the groups didn't like each other. Some of them didn't even know each other. Um, and there were leftist groups as well, but the anarchists had the stronger presence. And but a lot of the one of the main values that they hold in common is this idea of solidarity. So they really don't like the Christian idea of, the Christian idea of charity, I think, is not what they're actually critiquing. They're critiquing a watered down version of that, like a kind of neoliberal, like philanthropy. But they associate that with Christianity, and they don't like it because they believe it creates a kind of client patron system.
Mm-hmm.
Um, where the fundamental humanity of the people being served and helped is barely part of the equation. Whereas they want to relate, all the way they relate to each other is, as much as possible horizontally. And so you're entering that space and you hear all these stories about anarchists and, oh, they're dangerous and violent and stuff like that. And a lot of the groups did actually believe in violence. Some of them were non-violent. Some of them were, believe in violence. And um, the police would raid their squats that they, had as um, their spaces, and there'd be like hundreds and hundreds of bottles that had this curious smell of petrol about them, because they were like making Molotov cocktails, preparing for the next riots or the next whatever. So there really was that, and when we moved there to the neighborhood, um, the the street fights between the anarchists and the police were like a weekly uh, um, you know um, occurrence, and it was really interesting. It was almost like they would they would have certain rules that they followed. So you could be standing just 10 meters off to the side from the anarchists, and like you wouldn't have to worry about anything. You'd just be sitting there watching them throw stones at each other and then throw tear gas back and forth and flashbangs, and you'd just be sitting there, you're standing there, and you could just observe it from one side, and it wouldn't be. It was very, very strange.
Mm.
And the big cars burning. I think in 2012 there was one like 2 or 3 month period where there was 2 or 3 cars burned every single week. Um, so it was kind of crazy. Um, but when you actually started getting to know the people and started um, like attending some of the events and the open discussions, what you encountered were these communities, self-organized communities that, and largely to do with the training that we'd received, um, in order to equip us to be church planters. You were able to recognize that there were so many touch points with the gospel. So, for instance, the way anarchist communities are organized uh, have a scary resemblance to how the church describes some features of the local church. You know, so this idea that they are to be, um, local. I think some of the features of an anarchist community are like local, small, voluntary, and temporary. And if you look at any one of those four, there are some deep theological um, realities there which map onto our conception of local church. And so you talk with these anarchists, and you think, because supposedly they've rejected religion, and they talk about Christianity as if it's something in the past,
Mm.
and they'd be genuinely surprised to encounter a Christian, and even more surprised that the Christian had come to them,
Mhm.
um, because their language is quite openly dismissive or hostile towards organized religion. But once you're there and they get past their bemusement, um, you very quickly find yourself talking the same language in many ways.
Mhm.
And it was the most, um, I think that was what I wasn't prepared for. I wasn't prepared to find it so easy to relate to and interact and to grow deeply affectionate of people that I thought I had absolutely nothing in common with.
Mhm. Mhm.
I grew up in um, I was a second generation immigrant. My father was a graphic designer. He had a small business that benefited greatly under like Margaret Thatcher's economic policy, and even more under Gordon Brown's. Ironically, even though Gordon Brown was centre left, he actually was kind of basically following in like Thatcher's neoliberal financial kind of policies, and so like in the space that I grew up in, um, my parents um, wouldn't have anything positive to say about the left. Um, and we weren't political animals, full stop. So I didn't really know very much. I just knew that, and certainly in conservative evangelical circles, the left is always considered to be like a threat or to be the thing that is um, undermining Christian values and the church and stuff like that. And so it was the biggest shock of my life, I think, to find that all the things that I thought would be hard were actually not hard at all. Um, and not even just um, not hard, they were not burdensome. They were they were enjoyable. They were things that I, began to, eh, I would approach them thinking that there's nothing else I could imagine myself doing. Um, and something I like when I was a student, there was one verse from 1 Thessalonians 2:8, which became very dear to me, which is, we loved you so much that we were delighted not only to share the gospel, but our whole lives because you become so dear to us. And I'd taken that in, and it really inspired me for evangelism and helped me navigate, some of my own hesitancy about accepting that call, really, to follow Christ and to be a witness to Christ. And and so I'd taken that on board really very much, and that's why I wanted to do this student work. Um, but when I went to live amongst the anarchists, I started to live it out,
Mm.
and it was like when you see yourself, when you see that verse being embodied in your life and in the life of your community, uh, like I said, there really isn't anything else that can come close to that feeling, I guess, where you're like, I can't believe I get to do this,
Mm-hmm.
um, and it's not actually the work itself that's attractive. It's the relationships. It's like, I love these people, and I never expected that I would be able to say that. Um, at some point, these people were a calling. They were a strategy document, you know, but
Mm-hmm.
now they're my friends. And so, um, yeah, I mean, I think one interesting thing about the early years, certainly, of planting in that kind of community, is in a community that's so hostile to Christianity, you can't cut any corners, um, because, and we were told by lots of people, that if they get even the slightest sense that you're coming here to turn the neighborhood into the thing that they, have spent half of their lives trying to put behind them, and um, to overturn, in terms of organized, institutional, oppressive religion. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, that's how they conceive of it. And if you're coming there representing that, they will they will take matters into their own hands to make sure that you are hounded out of the neighborhood. And I remember we spoke with a journalist who'd come over to do some documentary work with the on the refugee crisis, and he was very, very familiar with Exarchia and with the anarchist community. He'd done a lot of collaborations on um, certain projects, and he asked how old the church was, and he could see all the things we were doing, and he just like commented, saying, "Well, if you're still here, there's only one reason for it. It's that they want you here.
Mm.
You don't get to decide whether you stay here. They decide." Um, and that was really encouraging for us, and it was borne out by the fact that, you know after a certain point, we knew maybe more of the people in the neighborhood than some some of the other people who were a lot more embedded, let's say, in the broader anarchist world, but not so much in that particular neighborhood. Um, I remember that at the anarchist space, they were having like a fight about something in one of the meetings, and there was a guy who was considered like the godfather of the Greek anti-authoritarian movement, and he was like a fixture there, um, an old timer, someone who would tell lots of stories, but then also he really knew his stuff. He understood the movement from the inside over many, many years. He'd done prison time for political reasons, and And in the middle of the conversation, he like just gestured over to me, and he's like, "Yeah, this and then there's this guy. He's been here forever." And I'd been there for 9 years, um, just a part of the space. And so this is where the web development came in. When we arrived, it was like the first couple of years, the economic crisis, and there was a lot of hopelessness, a lot of youth unemployment was going up to 60%, and and I just thought, well, what can I do to help? And one thing that came to mind was I'd learned how to build websites with in my dad's company. He didn't know. I had to teach myself. And back in 2007, when I was doing this, there weren't really much. I didn't have the money or the time to go to a course, so I just sat down and tried to find free resources. And there were these free tutorials that people have been putting online, and I learned just through reading these tutorials. And I said, well, that maybe I can do that for other people. So I asked around the neighborhood, and I said, where is there free classes? And everyone said the name of this one space. It was called Nosotros, and which is Spanish for we, um, and and it was this anarchist social center. So I went there and I asked if I could do this class, and they're like, "Yeah, sure. When can you start?" They were just as simple as that. They didn't even ask my name, you know. Like as soon as they realized I'm from the neighborhood and wanted to help out, and so I was just going there for 9 years, every single week with my little projector and laptop, and teaching people how to code websites. But I also, as one of the teachers, I was taking part in the weekly assembly that helped to run the space. And most of the time I sat there and didn't say anything. Um, but over time, everyone knew that I was a pastor. Um, and over time, I just became like part of the furniture, as
Mhm.
this throwaway comment showed. And then this guy ended up inviting me to speak at an anarchist festival that he was organizing. Um, and the title of my talk was The Christian Understanding of Mutual Aid.
Mm.
And so I gave a talk on that alongside two other panelists, and I got to critique the father of anarchism, who's Peter Kropotkin. I critiqued his book on mutual aid, and then I gave like the Christian perspective, and we just had this wonderful evening. Um, and so that wasn't just a throwaway comment. There was a mutual appreciation and a trust that had been built up there, and it worked both ways.
Yeah, well, what's fascinating, there's a lot of fascinating things about the story you've shared it, but one of the things that stands out is just how willing you and I imagine, I don't know when you got married in this whole process, but just willingness to just uh, enter in and live there, and just be a part of life there in that community. I mean, in missiology, we talk about an incarnational model, and of course, the incarnation of Christ is a unrepeatable event. But if we look at that as a pattern or a paradigm for how we are to move towards other people and really just, yeah, incarnate is a good word for that describes what we're called to do when we're called to a people or a community like this, is just to enter in and to draw near and to just live life among them so that you can understand them from the inside and build those relationships that are genuine. And over time they trust you and they're like, he's one of us. And Jesus Christ is one of us, yet he's different, and you are one of them but yet also different. And um, that really stood out to me in your story. And how, I've heard you talk about contextualization, but how important is that really entering in for a long period of time? How important is that before we can really even do contextualization?
Yeah, I mean, it goes hand in hand, and there's some parts of this where there isn't even any particularly like distinctly Christian um, Christian insight in that. Like, if you want to learn a culture and communicate in their language, you need to put in the hours of
Hmm. Hmm.
going in with both a posture of learning so listen more than talk, ask questions rather than give answers. But then you also need to you need to learn the practices. So you need to go deeper than the surface level of just being able to communicate, because if you're just learning um, in a formal sense um, what you need to do in order to communicate, the substance actually doesn't change. You're just translating your own culture and your concepts into a form that um, they can understand on some level, but it's still fundamentally alien,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not, so you actually need to enter into their story and begin to translate at that deeper level. And so I think I try, I would liken it to the difference between and it's not a hard distinction, but the difference between translating a kind of a scientific text, where for the most part you would have an equivalent word and they would map onto each other um, fairly neatly. There's definitely going to be some semantic offset there. But there's a huge difference between that, where for the most part you can have a fairly neat mapping of one to one, compared to like translating poetry.
Mm-hmm.
You know, where poetry, is full of metaphor. It's full of references from, you know, from both the poet's imagination, but then also from their own culture, from the place they were when they wrote it. And do you need to understand all these things in order to appreciate the poem? No, but you do in order to translate it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
you
Right.
know, um, and so it's possible to be in a culture and to understand the poem. But if you want to be able to write poetry, you need to be able to render what you're saying in the like the idiom and the metaphor and the narrative um, language of the people who are receiving it. And Bible translators have this issue as well. How and it's just that um, in an incarnational form, I guess. You know,
Yeah.
um, and so, but I think what I would emphasize is, even though you need to put in the work and you need to put in the time, you can start doing it from day one as well.
Mm.
Because it's actually the easiest thing to sit down and ask questions and hear and start getting understanding from day one, and then just respond to that. And sometimes, because people, it's not a one-way thing. It's not you're there to learn from them and then you deliver something else. It's a two-way exchange of stories and experiences, and it's the same God. Um, so one thing we can learn from the anarchists is that we do need to move away from this understanding of I'm the patron, you're the client. I'm the savior, you're the sinner. Like there's only one savior, it's Christ, and we are, coming. Uh, we're trying to testify to Christ from within a new culture, a new space. So yes, we need to learn how to do that, but actually, you can make a lot of mistakes and still communicate well if you're there with this, this posture of humility and learning and seeking to connect rather than to connect in order to, you know, uh, to get some
To
kind
get
of
some rest. Yeah. Oh, it
yeah
sounds like you're saying it's not so much it's a process or some, but it's more of a posture, and that posture can be there from the first day.
yeah exactly. And
Hmm.
I think one other thing I would say is that um, like you're neither communicating it into your own space that's familiar to you, neither will you ever be communicating fully in terms that they understand, like someone who's local to there. And so you're almost like creating this liminal space where you're saying, like, there is a point where we're going to connect. So I think, one insight I would have is that, um, uh, like, the need to dig deeper, um, is comes out of a need of saying, look, like, I don't know what the gospel needs to look like for you, um, but actually, it's something that we can work out together.
Mm-hmm.
And the love and affection that you develop for the other person actually gives you this motivation to dig deeper than you would otherwise have done, if it's just something you're doing, because it's like a day job, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
You really, really want to go that extra mile to accommodate, um, like, yourself to your friend, um, but without compromising the gospel.
Mm.
So it's faithfulness to Christ, love for Christ, love for your neighbor. I mean, like, that really does shape mission in very deep ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, you spent 12 years there, is that right? Working, planting this church and then pastoring this church as
Yeah,
it grew.
yeah,
And the lessons that you've learned from that experience and contextualized for a very, not just for Greece, not just for Athens, but for a very particular neighborhood in Athens with its own character. Y'all were able to do that, and now you're serving in a role that's serving church planting across Europe. Can you share with us just like how what lessons have you taken from your own church planting pastoral experience and now trying to help other pastors, church planters implement in such a rich variety of cities and even within cities, neighborhoods, et cetera? How are you trying to pass that on to aspiring church planters through City to City Europe Network?
yeah. That's a great question. I mean, I actually find that I speak very little about my own church planting experience when I talk with other church planters, and that's for two reasons. The first reason is very similar to the reason why I didn't speak very much when I first moved to the area, because when you are going to a new place and you're trying to, um, you're trying to understand, um, in order to serve, uh, your job there is to listen more than to speak in
Mm-hmm.
many ways. Um, and so a large part of what I do is just making space for, church planters and network leaders to share what they're doing and what their challenges are, how it's affecting them, and that's a real privilege. Um, the second reason is because as you hear these stories, what the thing that's helpful to share is uh, is very rarely the thing that you have experienced. But because I'm traveling around lots of places, I now am able to draw on lots and lots of different stories. And so most of the time, I find myself sharing insights and experiences that I've picked up from talking with all these church planters,
Mm.
and saying, hey, what you're going through sounds like what they're doing in this place. And let me tell you a little bit about their experience and what they shared with me. Um, and and because it's you see there's a moment where they're like, oh, I'm not the only one going through this, or I'm not the only one facing this challenge, or, um, I'm not such an idiot. Other people are feeling confounded by this challenge. Um, that is rewarding in and of itself. Seeing people, being, encouraged and built up, just from that realization. But then also, uh, I'm able then to build connections. So I'm not there in order to be the answer, but I can help them find answers.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, one of the huge benefits of having, an organization like City to City, which basically has no skin in the game. We are, a resourcing, support organization. Um, and we're also a network in the sense that we bring people together and they want to stay connected, and then we convene them and we facilitate that. But we don't own the network. There's no ownership. Is that like us existing alongside people in that way allows us to have the kind of access that not many people would otherwise have because we're genuinely not trying to get anything out of it.
Mm-hmm.
So we're there in order to find out what they need, help them like fill out that picture, you know, um, like affirm the vision, maybe enrich it in any way we can, uh, but then also connects them to the things they need in order to flourish, to be well supported, well resourced, and to have community. Um, and I think one of the number one things that takes church planters out of action is isolation. And it's the number one tactic of the devil, if you think about it. The moment the devil isolates you, he has an advantage, or at least he thinks he does, and usually it works out that way. Because, and so just on a spiritual level and in the level of the sustainability of the ministry, church planters being a little bit less isolated, a bit more connected, and then obviously well resourced, well trained. Um, for me, that is that is a real privilege because I definitely wouldn't have been able to last 12 years without the support, the kind of support I received through City City. Um, and I just feel I've been given this opportunity to pay it forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Give us a little bit of a, bird's eye view, a sweep of the landscape of what God is doing in urban, cities of Europe. In America, often what you hear about Christianity of Europe is, really dismal, and it's just faded out of sight entirely. But that's just not true. God is at work, and there's some really wonderful things happening. But can you just briefly share with us what you see God is doing through the efforts of church planters and church planting?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we probably have a fairly limited perspective because we engage with cities and we engage with historically the even though we connect with people from any and every denomination who are gospel centered, um, historically there's been a stronger connection with maybe some more reform churches across Europe. Um, and there's loads more church planting happening outside the city um, space than within it. Um, I think what City has done well is it's equipped people to plant churches that are um, genuinely in a position to wrestle with the where the culture is and where it's going. Um, and so lots of people who either are not um, let me put it this way, either an individual or a church that is seeking to connect um, with people who wouldn't naturally find themselves going to a church or being invited to a church or wouldn't have the opportunity to um, get to know a Christian believer. They come to us because of the tools that City provides. Um, and the thing is that that's actually really hard to do. Um, and so what we saw is, from about 2005 onwards, there was a lot of people that got excited about the potential of being equipped to plant churches that was reaching secular people in some of the larger cities in Europe. And to date, so now about maybe 20 years later, we just did a data drive the first time ever. um, and we we have helped around 260 churches be planted in about 40 something cities in Europe, um, which is in 20 years is not a very large number, but it's not an insignificant number either. Um, and I think what so now we're now in a position where we can start extracting some of the insights that are beyond anecdotal.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what we're seeing is that City has genuinely helped people plant churches that are um, drawing in and reaching secular people. There are some churches that have learned how to um, how to be intercultural, so they would be in the language of that country, but they would be very proactive about welcoming immigrant communities and establishing small groups that are a way in for certain language groups and new arrivals to come in. Um, so there's all these different kinds of things that have happened and different ways that people have used the tools and the training and are trying to contextualize the gospel. Um, but what we've seen is that there was like a wave of church planting for maybe 10 years or so. And then everyone started to hit a wall, you know, because it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and you know, there's not a massively high rate of churches closing or church plants failing. Um, we don't have the final number on that yet because we need to do the third phase of that data drive to get some of that more granular data. But I think what we're seeing is that some of the early church planters um, they became like these big success stories, um, and they were celebrated. And I would say Exarchia Church is probably one of those um, those stories, and that I think gave a little bit of it was a bit of misleading advertising because I think a lot of people, younger leaders coming through, were thinking, "Oh, that looks amazing! I'd love to do that." Um, but in order to see if something's worth following on from, you kind of need to wait 10 years.
Right.
So they were looking at these things, 4 or 5 years into them when they were still, on this growth curve before they were really tested. Um, and I think and so lots of things imploded for different reasons. And then the people coming after, they either found it very hard or they got discouraged by seeing, their heroes fall.
Mm.
Um, and you had, so let me put the positive side to all of this. Wherever you had church planters in a city who realized how hard it was and then started connecting across denominational lines to other church planters and forming church planting collectives and started to just serve each other, pray for each other, celebrate each other, and support each other and walk together on that church planting journey and vision. Those are the places that are still going today and are actually experiencing healthy growth and like real multiplication.
Mm.
And I think, there's it might seem blindingly obvious looking at it from the perspective of today that going at it yourself and creating celebrities and and I don't know how much of that was borrowed from like American celebrity culture and how much that just becomes an excuse for our own sinfulness. Probably a bit of both, more the second. um, but I'm really, really encouraged at seeing how many of these stories that were not the ones that were maybe celebrated that much, they're the ones who are now actually leading the way.
Mm.
Um, so, and I get to go around and visit them and see up close. And, the thing I look out for when I enter a room full of church planters is not what's being said so much, although obviously that's important, but I try and just get a feel for the spirit in the room. And I mean that with a small s, in the sense of um, not not purely, not that some kind of emotional thing, neither my own limited understanding of, what the connections are like, but seeing um, how the bond of the spirit is being worked out in that community, and how it's the gospel that is actually driving things forward rather than just being something that they are naming because they're part of City City. We've always been known as the gospel guys, and it can become like a trap because one generation says it, the next one assumes it, the third one discards it, and it's um, like if the gospel is still the driving force, the real engine at the heart of it all, then actually you can see, and now we are beginning to see things that have lasted 10 years plus. You can see what are the things that are lasting, um, where there's a robustness and a vitality that is beyond the hype.
Mhm.
And so in that way, I'm very, very encouraged and positive about where the movement is going, um, and the um, and the fact that it's across Europe means that we're beginning to learn from each other. And I like the fact that the stories that are being whispered are not just about the discouragements, but actually about, wow, did you hear what's happening there?
Mhm.
And it's no longer in these terms of these guys, they went in and it's this really difficult place, and look at how big their church is, and all that kind of stuff. That's what we used to talk about. These days, we're talking about the friendships
Mm,
between gospel workers,
mm.
um, and and how that is actually the thing that is leading to churches being multiplied and people being served, and the names are fading to the side. And I think the Holy Spirit is the one who's starting to get a bit more of the glory.
Wow, that's beautiful. I know you and I've talked about uh, New Begin's vision for unity, visible unity of the church in a place, and how that's um, it's a reflection of an ontological reality that we are one in Christ. We don't act like it always, but when we do, it has a genuine missional impact. But and then he explores the question of, well, how do you establish that unity? In the Protestant tradition, often we rely on very well crafted creeds and confessions and faith doctrinal statements that, okay, if you can sign on here and I can sign on here, now we can be united. But what you're talking about is something entirely different. You mentioned the bond, how the bond of the Spirit, which is unbreakable in Christ, how that's being lived out and leaned into and enjoyed through friendship. That's a very different thing than, can we iron out a doctrinal statement over here? And you know, it's much more personal, relational. Um, yeah, it's the love of the Spirit that
Yeah,
holds us together, not some
yeah,
other thing.
yeah.
And you're seeing that. That's really encouraging.
Yeah, I mean, I think for much of the history of the church in Europe, that the battleground has been a piece of paper, like these creeds and these things. Um, Whereas actually the real battlefield is our hearts.
Mm,
And so when people recognize that, they don't discard the paper. The paper is important. Like our unity is confessional and creedal at our heart, in a very real way. But it's the way in which we apply the gospel and where we recognize the real battlefield to be. If we recognize it as our hearts, we will accept living in the discomfort of a slightly differing approach to ministry and certain aspects of theology and secondary issues and stuff like that,
mm,
if we are coming together to apply the gospel and fight the real battle,
mm,
which is, we're called to preach the gospel. The devil is trying to make sure that doesn't happen. How can we support each other to make sure that we last the course ourselves, but then also sharpen each other in terms of ministry effectiveness, um, and even in terms of like getting insights from each other about how we how do we even engage with this culture? Sharing church planters sharing stories with each other sparks so many ideas. And I was talking with a church planter just 2 days ago, and he was saying, like, and we were just sharing, we're just bouncing ideas off each other. And he's like, this is like the most creative and encouraging conversation I've had for months. And it's not because I was saying anything particularly special or important. It was just that sharing of the journey together.
Mm-hmm.
And you finally feel that, hold on a sec, this might actually be possible because I'm not alone, and because I'm this conversation is helping me get past certain mental blocks, in terms of how do I navigate this challenge, whether it's a ministry challenge or a contextualization challenge, or even like a structural challenge. Like, how do I organize the church in a certain way? And many of most of the time that's actually a question of contextualization, um, not of like a purely practical or functional thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, couple questions. Unfortunately, got to draw conversation to a close here today. But one is very simple question: if folks wanted to follow along more with what's going on via City to City Europe, where do they find that? How can they follow? What are some ways they can follow along with what you guys are doing?
Um, well, in Europe, church planters connect with us usually by, um, if they want to attend a training or something like that. We have an intensive and some other things that we do. But the main point of entry is, if it already exists, someone who's already planting in your local region, um, to find out more about what that looks like locally, because we're never ever inviting people to join City City.
Mm-hmm.
We as City City are always seeking to come alongside people who are either church planting or thinking about church planting, and saying, how can we help you do that? How can we help you survive in that? And so one of the main points of connection would be, we have a conference or a network gathering every 18 months or so, 12 to 18 months. Um, and that helps people stay connected with each other, because we don't want to be the broker of all of the connections, the relationships. We want to bring people together and step out of the way. And one of the best places that happens is at conferences. There are regional and network and city gatherings. And so our staff are constantly traveling around and helping people think through what it might look like to set up something like this. But then also helping them realize when it might be too early to do that,
Mm-hmm.
or when there might already be an existing collaborative structure in a city, which is a better vehicle for the church planting vision. So there's no need to set up something new, but to find some way to become part of that, and to enrich that by their presence, and then maybe introduce some resources that space wouldn't otherwise have had without the connection with City City. And so um, there's lots of ways for someone like completely on the outside. um, if they know someone on the ground who's planting, they reach out to them directly. But sometimes people have said, "Hey, I want to help out in some way," and then they can just reach out to us directly, and we can start a conversation. Because, I mean, one thing I will say is, um, like I said before, I mean, I think I said this before, like, church planting teaches you or reminds you that all mission is cross-cultural. There's no such thing as cross-cultural mission and then mission. All mission is cross-cultural. And that means that I think someone from outside Europe that's wanting to come and serve the church in Europe, they shouldn't be scared to do so. They should be aware of the failure rate, especially of American missionaries, um, and how they are often unwelcome and ineffective, and can even be harmful. But wherever that's worked, it's worked spectacularly well. And I, for one, very, very much welcome anyone who wants to come and serve the church, because the thing that I was called to do, I was a very unlikely candidate for doing what I did, and I cannot forget that. And um, God, when He calls someone, He will test them. He will take them through the fire. And far be it from me to stand in someone's way. So I want to be open to talk to anyone who would love to come and serve in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, like I said, where it has worked, it's worked really well. And I'd love to see more of it.
That's wonderful. Well, last question here is how can we be praying for your work, and even if there's something you personally, and then I'll close our time in prayer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, we are in a period of, I guess, sharpening that our vision, our mission as Citizens of Europe, because I mean, up until recently, I spoke of it as like standing before like the second mountain, the second mountain concept of, we had the first mountain of enthusiasm and high activity and a lot of success. And then, there was the valley of coming down to earth, seeing how hard it really was, seeing some of the way, not just the facts that some things fell apart, but the way they fell apart, the reasons they fell apart. And um, in some ways that can lead you to saying, hey, do we even want to keep doing this? And the second mountain is like it's not, oh, let's have another go. It's um how can we do this? How can we climb this second mountain, um taking on board everything we've learned, both the encouragements and the blessings and the insights, but then also the lessons learned and the things that the blind spots that were revealed. And so I guess pray for all of us um, as we cast vision for something that is still, I think, just as ambitious as it always was, to see, you know, um, a church in every um, unreached neighborhood of Europe. So there shouldn't be an unreached urbanite in Europe who isn't able to know like a Christian believer.
Mm-hmm.
That's the vision. Um, and we'd love to see, I think we're saying at the moment, like 120 cities in Europe be, catalyzed for church planting over the next few years. We're serving about 40 something now. And so I think for me, the prayer would be, not just for provision for the resources and the capacity to be able to build our team, to be able to serve church planters, but to know how to steward well um, all of these people who are being called into ministry that we are interacting with. That sometimes you only have a certain amount of time with each person. What is it that is what is it that we've learned along the way that could actually be truly edifying, to help them last the course in ministry, whether they stay part of the City community or not?
Mm-hmm.
And I would love for there to be stories like that, where people come to a deeper understanding of the gospel, um, by during their time interacting with someone from City, and usually it's going to be another church planter. It's going to be
Mm-hmm.
someone in their own city that they are sharing that journey with, and so maybe just to put it into encapsulate in one thing, I would love to see these little pockets of true gospel collaboration, not for the sake of collaboration, but for the sake of gospel witness,
Mm-hmm.
um, for to see more of those spring up all over Europe,
Yeah.
where it's not just people planting churches, but it's people who are um, uh, investing deeply in each other as they plant churches,
Yeah.
and in the gospel. Um, if that starts happening more and more, I think it means that we are building something that actually will be able to go beyond us,
Mm-hmm.
because it's being carried by something that is not one person's vision or one person's effort, but it's what the church is supposed to be.
Mm. Amen. Well, let me pray.